The UPS 2976 investigation has already revealed a failure sequence that pushed the MD-11 far beyond its design assumptions. But what stands out even more is what the pilots did. They countered the roll, corrected the yaw, and followed their training, but nothing changed the outcome. And that raises a much deeper question than simply, what failed on the airplane? Why did this scenario fall so far outside anything pilots are taught, practiced, or even expected to survive? If modern training covers engine failures, rejected takeoffs, asymmetric thrust, and emergency procedures, what made this one different? Let's find out in this video. Let's start with something MD-11 pilots often say quietly: this jet can bite. On paper, the MD-11 is a capable heavy tri-jet with roots in the DC-10 lineage. But once you're actually flying it, you notice quirks that make it different. The center engine sits high on the tail. The wings were redesigned and slightly smaller than the DC-10s. And the aircraft's pitch stability is far more sensitive, especially at high weights and high thrust. What does that mean for asymmetric thrust situations? Well, picture yourself rotating on takeoff. When you push 3 big engines forward, the aircraft reacts strongly. But if only one engine suddenly surges or one drags and the other 2 don't match, the aircraft reacts even more strongly. In a typical multi-engine jet, losing one engine on takeoff causes a predictable yaw. You counter with rudder, keep the wings level, and climb away. That's something pilots practice constantly. But the MD-11 isn't a twin. It's a tri-jet with engines arranged in a way that creates complex yaw and roll coupling. Engine 2 is on the tail. Engines 1 and 3 are out on long wings. So when one engine doesn't behave like the others, the airplane doesn't just yaw, it can twist, it can roll, it can pitch slightly differently, and the corrective inputs are less intuitive than on a twin-engine airliner. Now, to be clear, MD-11 pilots do practice engine out procedures at V1. They practice heavyweight climb outs. They practice the classic one engine at takeoff thrust, the other 2 at idle scenario, but they don't practice what happened to UPS 2976 because that scenario exists outside the training envelope. Here's how pilot training works for situations like this. In the simulator, every airline, FedEx, UPS, and former operators like Lufthansa Cargo trains MD-11 crews on engine failures at V1. It's standard. You advance the throttles, an engine fails just as you commit to takeoff, and you climb out with controlled yaw. Pilots practice it so many times that the muscle memory becomes automatic. They also train for split thrust events, but only of a certain type, subtle mismatches, maybe a spool-up lag or one engine temporarily underperforming. These are manageable, but imagine you push the throttles forward and one engine is producing significantly less thrust than the others, maybe due to an internal failure or high vibration, while the other 2 engines are still pushing at takeoff power. That is still just within the realm of training. Second engine suddenly overshoots, or surges, or reacts unpredictably. Suddenly you have an aircraft that the simulator does not replicate well because the real-world aerodynamics are messy. That's the problem with training. Simulators cannot fully recreate multiple cascading failures happening during the most aerodynamic critical second of flight rotation. There's a reason FAA and ICAO training manuals make it clear. Multi-engine loss or severe asymmetric thrust during rotation is not a recoverable scenario in most transport category aircraft. So airlines train pilots for things that are survivable and study the things that aren't. When we look at UPS 2976, we have to place it correctly in that framework. This wasn't a standard engine failure at V1 event. This was something the MD-11 is not designed to handle gracefully. A high power, low altitude asymmetric thrust divergence happening during rotation, exactly in the second where the aircraft is most vulnerable. And even small aerodynamic differences matter at that moment. At rotation, the wings are not fully lifting yet. The rudder is only starting to bite. The tail is aerodynamically dirty due to wake and angle of attack. The MD-11's big tail-mounted engine creates pitch effects that aren't linear, and if thrust is uneven, the yaw isn't steady, it pulses. In other words, the airplane is in a delicate transitional state. Now, imagine dealing with that while the aircraft is accelerating through 150 knots. It's not a checklist scenario, it's survival. To understand why the MD-11 behaved the way it did during the UPS 2976 takeoff, let's get inside the cockpit and look at what a pilot would actually feel. Imagine you're raising the nose. You're expecting a smooth, steady rise, but instead, the nose starts to rotate more aggressively than normal. That's the hallmark of a pitch-sensitive aircraft at high thrust. And the one wing dips not suddenly, but with a rolling tendency that feels alive, like something is pushing from the side. This isn't the classic one engine failed feeling pilots train for. It's more chaotic. The yaw pushes your seat sideways. The roll wants to take the aircraft off its center line. And the pitch may feel slightly sluggish or slightly eager, depending on which engine is misbehaving. MD-11 pilots often describe this jet as fine when everything is perfect, demanding when something is not. And here's the key aerodynamic challenge. At rotation, you don't have enough altitude, airspeed, or control authority to counter large thrust imbalances. The rudder is the biggest limiting factor. Below about 200 feet, even full rudder may not counter certain yaw moments at max takeoff power. And when yaw becomes too strong, the aircraft side slips, meaning the fuselage is no longer pointing the same direction as the aircraft's path. That creates rolling moments. Rolling moments create bank. Bank reduces lift. Reduced lift pulls the aircraft toward the ground. In a twin-engine jet, this is simpler. You have one dead side and one live side. You push rudder, keep wings level, climb. In a trijet with one tail-mounted engine, you get interacting forces that are harder to predict. Add the MD-11's tendency to lose lift more abruptly when bank angle increases on rotation, and you have an extremely fragile moment. It's worth saying clearly, the crew of UPS 2976 was experiencing something that training does not and arguably cannot fully prepare a pilot for. So what does all this technical detail have to do with UPS 2976? It gives us the context to understand why this crash unfolded so quickly and why even an experienced crew would struggle in those exact seconds. When we combine the aerodynamic quirks of the MD-11, the limitations of simulator training, and the realities of high-power takeoff physics, a picture emerges. UPS 2976 was likely pushed into a corner of the flight envelope that the MD-11 is not designed to be stable in, and which pilots are not trained to recover from, because recovery simply isn't feasible at that altitude. The two earlier videos laid out the NTSB's early findings and the sequence of events. What we're adding here is the deeper why behind those findings. Why asymmetric thrust is so dangerous, why the MD-11 reacts more violently than other jets, why the simulator doesn't train pilots for what happened, and why the crew struggle makes sense not as a failure of skill, but as a result of physics. This is also why accident investigators are so careful when analyzing cockpit actions in these moments. At 20, 30, 40 feet above the ground, there is no room for trial and error, no time for checklists, no possibility to stabilize. Everything comes down to fractions of a second and forces that exceed human reaction time. As tragic as this crash is, it reinforces something important in aviation safety. There are scenarios where the aircraft must be protected through maintenance, engineering, and system reliability, because pilots alone cannot save the airplane once certain thresholds are crossed. And that's why the NTSB investigation matters so much here. Not to place blame, but to understand how UPS 2976 entered such a narrow and unforgiving corner of the MD-11's performance envelope, and how future flights can be protected from ever going near it again. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Fly safe.